Hey, seventh graders. Quick review of the Cornell notes that we have done this week. Next to my head here, we've got a filled out copy of the Cornell notes from 2 weeks ago from this section, What is Science? So at the top there, what we're going to be answering is what is scientific inquiry? Then we've got a list of vocabulary words here. Science, that's the investigation and exploration of natural events and of the new information that results from those investigations. Observation, that is going to be using one or more senses to gather information and take notes of what occurs. An inference is a logical explanation about any observation that is drawn from your prior knowledge. A hypothesis is a possible explanation about an observation that can be tested by scientific investigations. A prediction is a statement of what's going to happen next in a sequence of events. Scientific theory, that is an explanation of observations or events based on knowledge that's gained from many observations. Sometimes these are facts and some are areas that are unproven. A scientific law describes a pattern or event in nature that is always true, so something that is always going to happen. Next, we've got critical thinking, comparing what you already know with the information that you're given in order to decide whether you agree with it. There were 4 review questions that went along with this Cornell notes assignment. The first one was using a flowchart on page NOS 6 and 7. What happens if a hypothesis is not supported? If you looked at that flowchart on the bottom of 6 and 7, it will be to modify and revise the hypothesis and then start over. The second was a key concept check, asking you what is scientific inquiry, and this was in one of the reading paragraphs. I pretty much just copied this right out of a sentence. Scientific inquiry is a process that uses a variety of skills and tools to answer questions or to test ideas about the natural world. There was another key concept check. What are the results of scientific investigations? There's essentially 3 things: new technology, new materials, and possible explanations of the natural events. And then the last one was a key concept check that is on the bottom of the screen here. If you see the red dot, how can a scientist minimize bias in a scientific investigation? That's by doing a blind study. And there was a diagram of a kid tasting different cereals in the textbook that showed you what a blind study would look like. You had an assignment also last week from Tuesday, where you needed to answer the questions that were along with this assignment. And so that goes with this. So that's these questions. You're going to fill those out and answer them as best you can. Use the notes, use the lesson outline that you did last Monday also. So also then, we've got the Cornell notes from this week. And this was a long one. I apologize for that. I got a little bit carried away. But it should have been pretty easy, although it was long. So we start out with some definitions. So description and explanation was the heading these fell under. Description is a spoken or written explanation of an observation. So if you look at this assignment, we don't need the word description there. It's going to be explanation. Then there's 2 different types of descriptions that you're going to see a lot of times. There's a qualitative observation or description, and that's going to be one that uses your senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. And then there are quantitative descriptions or observations, and those would be ones that have numbers. So if you were counting things in an experiment, those would be a quantitative description. An explanation is an interpretation of observations. The International System of Units, as you're reading through the text, that's your next topic following the red headings. Sorry, my pump is beeping here. The International System of Units is an internationally accepted system for measurement. You have probably heard of the metric system, and the metric system is essentially the same thing as the SI system. But We don't use that in the United States. Pretty much every other country in the world does use it. I believe there are 2 countries that do not use it, the United States and a country called Myanmar, which used to be called Burma, which is a small country in Southeast Asia. Someone did tell me last week that there's 5 countries, but I'm pretty sure it's 2. Next, you had a chart that you were filling out using the textbook, where you just needed to write down the units that went with each type of measurement. This was a chart in the textbook, you just needed to copy it. Length is meter, mass is kilogram, according to our textbook. I disagree with that. I think that it should just be gram. Then we have second is used for time. Amperes is used for electric current. Kelvin is the unit for temperature. 1 unit Kelvin is equal to 1 unit in Celsius, and you've probably used Celsius before. But 0 degrees Kelvin is what they call absolute zero. That is the temperature where the movement of all molecules stops. And so hopefully you remember from last year that when even solids are around you, solids have molecules that are vibrating in place. And so at absolute zero, that stops. And so 273 degrees Kelvin is actually equal to 0 degrees Celsius, but the size of the units are the same. It's just 273 off, okay? Moles are used for measuring substances. When you get into 9th grade science, and if you take chemistry in high school, you'll learn more about using moles and use those measurements. Candela is used for light intensity. If you buy a new flashlight or if you're looking at light bulbs, it may give you a number for candelas for the brightness. Then we had a chart that showed the different prefixes that are used when you're using the metric system in front of those base units. So the first one, number 8 here, is mega, and that is 1 million. I'm going to do number 11 here. Deci is 1/10. Then, sorry, as I move my picture around here. A kilo is equal to 1,000, so a kilometer is 1,000 meters. Hecto is 100. Centa is equal to 1/100th, and milla is equal to 1/1000th. Then we've got a couple more vocabulary words here. Accuracy is the description of how close a measurement is to its accepted or true value. Precision is the description of how similar or close measurements are to each other. If you look in the textbook, there's some diagrams that show you a bow and arrow and a target, or arrows and a target, they don't show you the bow, that are used to represent how accuracy and description can be seen. Measurement and accuracy is the next heading in the textbook. The tools that you're using to make measurements are going to limit your accuracy. So if you have a tool that has very, very large units, you're going to have to guess if it is not a full unit. So for example, if you had a stick that you knew was exactly 1 foot or 1 meter, that's going to be the closest you can get to it without making an estimation, without having smaller units labeled on that tool. Significant digits are something that we don't deal with a lot, but it has to do with the number of digits that are known for certain in a measurement, so how reliable they are. Now we're getting into the scientific tools, and this is a little more relevant information to what we're going to be doing this year. You have a scientific journal that's going to be used for recording descriptions, explanations, plans, and steps in a scientific inquiry. A balance can be used to measure the mass of an object. You probably used a triple beam balance last year. In the gizmo from last week, you would have used a triple beam balance. Number 3, the temperature of substances is measured using a thermometer. Number 4, the Kelvin is the SI unit for temperature, but in science, we don't use the Kelvin. Normally, we're going to be using Celsius. Thermometers should only be used, they should not be used to stir anything because they're going to break. They're made of glass generally. Liquids are held, poured, and heated and measured in laboratory glassware, like a graduated cylinder or a beaker. A microscope is used to observe small objects and cannot be observed with the unaided eye. Hopefully we'll get to use microscopes this year. Computers, something we use every day. They're used for compiling, retrieving, and analyzing data for reports. You could use them to create reports and other documents and to send information to others and to research information. Hardware is the actual physical components of the computer, like the monitor or the keyboards, or your iPad would be an example of hardware. Software is the term that's used for the programs that run on the computers, just like the apps. Apps that you use are considered software. All right, the last little section here, tools that are more specifically used by life scientists. A handheld lens that magnifies or enlarges the image of objects observed through it is called a magnifying lens. You may be familiar with the magnifying glass. That's going to be the same thing. To prepare objects or substances for observation under a compound microscope, you would use a thin rectangular piece of glass called slides. So when we use microscopes this year, hopefully we'll be able to, we'll be using slides to put the things on that we're looking at. Number 3, scalpels and scissors are dissecting tools that are used to examine specimens, organs, or prepared organisms. We may use those if we get to do dissecting at the end of the year. And then the last one, number 4, a small piece or a small glass or plastic tube similar to an eyedropper that's used to draw up liquids or transfer them to another place is called a pipette. So you have probably used an eyedropper or a dropper to like measure medicine maybe. Those are called pipettes. There are 4 review questions that I would like you to do here. There were 8 in the textbook, but I didn't feel that all those were necessary. First one, explain the relationship between a description and an explanation. So if you look back at the definitions on the first page of this document or in the textbook on page NOS 12, they will have information that will help you to explain the connection between a description and an explanation. Number 2, what's the International System of Units? That's one of the vocab words in this Cornell Notes worksheet. Number 3 is a multiple choice question. Which tool would a scientist use to view a tiny organism? That would be one of those options, multiple choice. You pick which one it is. Look back at the tools section. And then lastly, write 3 base units used in the SI system. Liters, meters, and grams are going to be the ones that we use most often. And then there's a summary at the bottom. So if you had to tell your friends at your lunch table what you talked about in science today or what you read about in science today, what would you say? Give me a sentence there. Okay? Thanks. Have a good day. Make sure you get this turned in Schoology. Easy points. I just gave you all the answers.